don't care what your boarding pass says. Women like you don't sit in row 1. Now get your things and move before I have security drag you out." The words landed like a slap across the quiet first-class cabin of Atlantic Crown Flight 117, loud enough for every passenger in the forward section to hear. The woman who said them didn't lower her voice. She didn't look embarrassed. She stood in the aisle with the Hermes bag on her arm and a certainty in her eyes that said she had never once in her life been told she was wrong, and fully expected that record to hold today. The woman she said it to didn't move. Diana Okafor sat in Suite 1A with her hands resting on her lap, her tablet open on the tray table in front of her, and an expression on her face that was so utterly, completely calm, it was almost unsettling. She didn't look up. She didn't look sideways. She looked at the screen in front of her the way a person looks at something they are not actually reading, processing something else entirely, something internal, something the woman standing in the aisle with the Hermes bag couldn't see and would never understand. She didn't respond. Not yet. Because Diana Okafor had learned something years ago in the specific school that only certain people are admitted to. The school of being told over and over again in rooms and airports and boardrooms and now apparently airplane cabins that you are in the wrong place. She had learned that the moment you respond with heat, you give the other person exactly what they want. You become the problem. You become the story. Diana preferred to be the ending. And in less than 40 minutes, every person who had played a role in what was unfolding in that cabin, the woman with the Hermes bag, the chief purser in the silver tie, the first officer who had touched her luggage without permission, every single one of them would lose something they would never get back. Not because Diana Okafor raised her voice, not because she called a lawyer or created a scene or said a single word that could be used against her, but because she picked up her phone and typed 3 words to her COO on the ground in New York. 3 words. And then she put the phone back on the armrest and waited because Diana Okafor had always been very good at waiting. She had been waiting her entire life for moments exactly like this one. And she had learned. At 26, at 33, at every age and in every room where someone had looked at her and decided she was in the wrong place, that the waiting always ended the same way, with the truth walking through the door and introducing itself. Before we go back to the moment this began, drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever been told you don't belong somewhere you absolutely had every right to be? Because what Diana Okafor did next is exactly what the rest of us wish we had the power to do. Hit subscribe if you believe that quiet power is the most dangerous kind. This story is about to show you what that looks like. Now rewind. 90 minutes earlier. Terminal 4 at John F. Kennedy International Airport hummed with the particular energy of a place that never sleeps. A low, continuous vibration of rolling suitcase wheels, muffled announcements, the distant percussion of a coffee machine behind a kiosk counter, and the smell of recycled air mixed with whatever cologne the man in front of you in the security line decided was a good idea for a transatlantic flight. Diana moved through all of it the way she moved through most things, efficiently, without drawing attention to herself, without the visible markers that most people in her financial position couldn't resist deploying. No first-class check-in entourage, no assistant carrying her bag, no visible logo on anything she wore. She had one carry-on, a matte charcoal roller case that was excellent luggage and looked like it cost $400, which was true, and which most people in the terminal would correctly identify as the bag of a reasonably successful professional, rather than the bag of a woman whose net worth had 11 digits. That was intentional. Diana Okafor, at 41 years old, was the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Meridian Holdings, a privately held investment conglomerate with assets across 4 continents and a reputation in financial circles for being, as one profile in a major business publication had put it, the most consequential firm most people have never heard of. She had built it from a single real estate acquisition at 29 years old, a 3-bedroom apartment building in Newark that she had bought with every dollar she had, and then some, and she had never once looked backward since. This morning, at exactly 6 o'clock Eastern Time, Apex Meridian Holdings had completed the finalization of a 14-month acquisition process. Atlantic Crown Airlines, a mid-size transatlantic carrier with a beautiful brand, a loyal customer base, and an internal culture that had been quietly rotting for years, was now officially and irrevocably a subsidiary of Apex Meridian. Diana had read the performance reports. She had read the customer complaint logs. She had read the HR files, the union briefs, the financial audits, and the satisfaction surveys that painted a picture of a company that had for too long been run by people who cared more about protecting their own comfort than serving the people who actually bought tickets and sat in the seats. She was going to fix that, starting today. And because Diana believed with the particular conviction of someone who had built something real from nothing that you cannot fix what you have never truly seen, she was going to fly today as a passenger. No advance notice to the crew, no announcement to the cabin, just a woman with a boarding pass and a window seat seeing exactly how her airline treated the people who trusted it. She had not anticipated needing to be told she didn't belong there. She should have. She had worked in corporate America for 17 years. She should have anticipated it. She settled into the priority lane at gate 14, her digital boarding pass already open on her phone. The gate agent scanned it with a professional smile, offered a quick welcome aboard. Ms. Okafor, enjoy the flight, and Diana stepped onto the jet bridge, pulling her roller case behind her, her mind already 3 moves ahead of where her feet were. She was thinking about the chief purser's file. She was thinking about the complaint logs she had reviewed the previous evening. She was thinking about the 47 operational changes she wanted to implement in the first 90 days, and the order in which they needed to happen to minimize disruption. She was not thinking about the woman who was about to walk into the first-class cabin behind her, and decide in approximately 4 minutes that Diana's existence in Suite 1A was a personal offense that required immediate correction. She would be thinking about that soon enough. The first-class cabin of Atlantic Crown Flight 117 was the kind of space that had been designed to make people feel like money was something that happened to other people. A distant, abstract concept rather than the actual reason they were here sitting in a suite with closing doors and a lie-flat bed and a menu that used words like hand-sourced and artisan to describe things that were at the end of the day food on a plane. There were 8 suites arranged in a 1-2-1 configuration, 4 on the port side, 4 on the starboard each with a closing shell door that gave the passenger inside the illusion of total privacy. The carpeting was a deep charcoal gray that showed no footprints. The overhead lighting cycled through 5 shades, none of which could be called unflattering. There was a small inlaid tray of complimentary chocolates in each suite that were very good, and which approximately a third of passengers actually touched, the rest being either too health-conscious or too distracted to remember they were there. Diana noticed 3 things the moment she settled into Suite 1A. First, the ambient lighting was set 2 shades too dark for comfortable reading, which created a relaxation atmosphere that was excellent for sleeping passengers and frustrating for working ones, a balance that was currently weighted in the wrong direction. Second, the jump seat in the aft galley, visible briefly as she had walked past, was worn through at the left armrest in a way that suggested the fabric had been overdue for replacement for at least a year. Third, the automatic fragrance diffuser near the forward galley was set to a setting called Coastal Breeze that smelled nothing like a coastal breeze and a great deal like a department store candle. It was too strong. It was the kind of detail that seemed minor until you were trapped in a sealed metal tube at 35,000 feet for 7 hours breathing it. She made 3 notes on her tablet, not as a passenger complaining, as a CEO cataloging. She was working through a 4th note, regarding the response time of the cabin pre-boarding safety check, which she had clocked against the posted timeline, when Lucia Reyes appeared at the entrance to her suite. Lucia was 27 years old, Hispanic with dark hair pulled back into a neat bun and the kind of posture that came not from military training, but from years of moving quickly through confined spaces without bumping into things. She wore the Atlantic Crown uniform, a navy blazer over a white blouse, with the easy comfort of someone who had long since stopped thinking about what she was wearing and started thinking only about what she was doing. She smiled at Diana. Not the automatic calibrated smile of someone performing hospitality, but the actual smile of someone who was genuinely glad another human being had sat down in front of them. It was a small distinction, but Diana noticed it. She noticed everything. "Good evening," Lucia said. "Welcome aboard. Can I get you something before we begin boarding? A drink, perhaps, or something from the pre-departure menu?" "Green tea, please," Diana said. "No sugar." "Of course. I'll bring that right out." Lucia moved to go, then paused. Not awkwardly, but with the natural hesitation of someone who had thought of something. "We have a jasmine green tonight, if that works, or a standard Darjeeling blend." "Jasmine," Diana said. "Thank you." Lucia nodded once and disappeared in the direction of the galley, with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that excellence in service was not about being visible but about making everything feel effortless. Diana watched her go and made a fifth note on her tablet. This one was not a criticism. Derek Holt entered the first-class cabin the way people enter spaces they have occupied for so long that the space has begun to take their shape, without announcing himself, without making eye contact with anyone he did not need to make eye contact with, moving down the aisle in a straight line that communicated without ambiguity that he was not here to be approached. He was here to manage. He was 48 years old, the chief purser of Atlantic Crown Flight 117, and he had held that title for 11 years. Before that, he had been a senior flight attendant for 6, and before that, a ground crew supervisor for 5. He had in total 22 years with Atlantic Crown, which was a fact he managed to work into conversations with a frequency that suggested he considered it a credential. He was a tall man, broad across the shoulders with silver at his temples that he wore with the self-conscious dignity of a man who had decided that aging gracefully was a personal brand, rather than an inevitable biological process. His uniform was immaculate. The silver tie that denoted his rank as chief purser was knotted with precision. His name tag sat exactly level on his left lapel. He moved past Suite 1A without stopping, without acknowledging Diana, without even a glance in her direction. Then he reached Suite 1C, where a man in a very good Ermenegildo Zegna suit was settling into his seat, and Derek stopped. He extended his hand. He smiled. Not the automatic hospitality smile, but the specific, slightly warmer smile of someone who has recognized a person worth smiling at more sincerely. "Mr. Ashford, wonderful to have you with us again." Derek said, the warmth in his voice entirely genuine. "I have the Remy Martin you prefer already decanted, and we have the Wagyu tonight. I'll make sure you're the first one offered." Mr. Ashford in 1C said something Diana couldn't hear, and Derek laughed, a rich, generous laugh, and said something else before moving on. He passed Suite 1A again on his way back to the galley, again without looking. Diana watched him and added a sixth note to her tablet. Caroline Whitmore arrived the way weather arrives. Not announced exactly, but impossible to ignore once present. She was 52 years old, the wife of Raymond Whitmore, managing director of Halcyon Wealth Partners, one of the larger private wealth management firms operating out of New York. She was dressed in what Diana could identify without particular effort as a Chanel suit in cream Louboutin heels that were an impractical choice for transatlantic travel, and carried a Hermes Birkin 35 in cognac leather that bumped with casual indifference against every armrest she passed in the aisle. Her face held the particular set of a woman who had arrived at an age where she had decided that everything should meet her standards, and that the failure of things to meet her standards was a problem with the things rather than the standards. She stopped in the aisle directly to the left of Suite 1A. She looked at her boarding pass, then she looked at Diana. Then she looked at the number above the suite. Then she looked at Diana again. It was not a curious look. It was not a confused look. It was the look of a woman doing a calculation, running Diana through a set of criteria in her head and arriving at a conclusion she did not bother to conceal. Diana had seen that look before, hundreds of times, in every configuration and context imaginable. She knew exactly what it meant, and she knew exactly what was going to follow it, and she kept her eyes on her tablet and waited. Raymond Whitmore trailed in behind his wife. He was 55, heavy-set, with the expensive, exhausted look of a man who had been wealthy for long enough that it had stopped being exciting and become simply the ambient condition of his existence. He carried a briefcase in one hand and his phone in the other, already looking at his screen before he had fully stepped into the cabin. He moved into Suite 2A behind Caroline without speaking. Thomas Brennan was already in 2K. He was 60 years old, a retired federal judge from the Second Circuit who was returning to London after a speaking engagement at Columbia Law School. He held a copy of the Wall Street Journal, though he was not reading it. He was watching the cabin in the way that people who have spent decades listening to testimony learn to watch things with stillness and comprehensive attention. He had noticed Diana when she boarded. He noticed the way she sat. He noticed the tablet. He noticed the 3 notes she had made in the first 5 minutes. He couldn't see what the notes said, but he recognized the cadence of someone cataloging rather than relaxing. He had decided based on nothing he could have articulated precisely that she was someone worth watching. Grace Olivero was in 3A, a travel journalist in her mid-30s who wrote for a publication that 300,000 very specific, very engaged readers received monthly and took seriously. She had a notebook open, an actual paper notebook, which she preferred for first impressions because she found that typing made her process too quickly and writing made her look more carefully. She was working on a piece about the evolution of transatlantic first-class service, and she had been taking notes since she stepped onto the jet bridge. She had noted Lucia's smile as genuine. She had noted Derek's selective warmth. She had noted Caroline Whitmore's entrance. And now she watched Caroline stop in the aisle beside Suite 1. A look at the black woman sitting quietly in the window seat and do the calculation. Grace's pen moved across the page. Caroline Whitmore rearranged her expression into something that bore a superficial resemblance to pleasantness. It was the social equivalent of painting over rust. The coating was there, but anyone who had been around long enough could see what was underneath. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calibrated to the specific register of someone who believes they are being extremely reasonable while also being the most important person in the room. "I think there may have been some sort of mix-up." Diana did not look up from her tablet. Caroline continued undeterred with the confidence of someone who had never encountered a silence she couldn't fill. "This suite, 1A. I'm fairly certain that's mine. I always fly 1A. My travel agent is very specific about it." She gave a small theatrical sigh, the kind that communicated both patience and the reaching of its limit. "These computer systems make errors all the time. If you just wanted to pop up and check with the attendant." "My boarding pass says 1A, Diana said. She did not look up. Her voice was level and held approximately the same emotional temperature as the cabin air. "I purchased this seat 6 weeks ago." Caroline blinked. The pleasantness adjusted itself, not disappearing entirely, but thinning. "Well, yes, but surely there's been some mistake. My husband and I fly Atlantic Crown every season. We have platinum status. I'm sure if you just spoke to one of the crew." "I have nothing to speak to the crew about," Diana said. "I'm in my seat." This was the moment when most people in Diana's experience would calculate the social cost of continuing and decide it wasn't worth it. Caroline Whitmore was not most people. Caroline Whitmore had been the kind of woman for decades who pushed until something gave, and she had spent so long in rooms where things gave when she pushed that she had forgotten the pushing itself was a choice. The pleasantness evaporated. "I beg your pardon," Caroline said, her voice dropping from performative warmth into something considerably colder. "I don't believe you understand what I'm saying. We always sit in row 1. It has been arranged. Do you understand what platinum membership means? Because I don't think you do." Diana set her tablet down. Slowly. She turned to look at Caroline Whitmore for the first time, and the look she gave was not hostile, not challenging, not heated in any direction. It was simply direct, the look of someone who is seeing something clearly and is content with what they see. "I understand what it means," Diana said. "It doesn't mean what you think it means in this situation." Caroline's jaw tightened. She turned toward the aisle and raised her voice by approximately 40%, directing it toward the galley. "Excuse me, flight attendant. Can I get some assistance, please? There's a situation here that needs to be resolved." Lucia Reyes appeared from the galley carrying a small tray with Diana's jasmine green tea. She registered the scene in the aisle in approximately 1 second. Caroline's posture, Raymond's deliberate invisibility behind his phone, Diana's stillness, and made the quiet calculation of a 27-year-old who had been doing this job long enough to recognize the particular shape of this problem. She set the tea carefully on Diana's tray table. "Your jasmine green, Ms. Okafor." "Thank you," Diana said. Caroline looked at the tea, then at Lucia. "This woman is in my seat," she said. 1A. I've already explained the situation to her, but she doesn't seem to understand. Can you please sort this out? Lucia took a breath that was small enough to be invisible. "May I see your boarding pass?" "Mrs. Whitmore. Caroline Whitmore. And my boarding pass says 2A, but that's clearly the error I'm describing. We always sit in 1A. We've sat in 1A for 15 years. Lucia looked at the boarding pass. Then she looked at Diana's phone where the digital pass was visible on screen. "Mrs. Whitmore, I can see your boarding pass does reflect seat 2A. Ms. Okafor's boarding pass reflects seat 1A. She said it neutrally, without emphasis in either direction, in the manner of someone presenting information rather than taking sides. The seats are essentially identical in terms of—" "They are not identical," Caroline said with the precision of someone correcting a fundamental error in logic. "Row 1 is served first. Row 1 has the forward closet access. Row 1 faces forward when we're on the ground. It is not the same as row 2, and I should not have to explain this to someone in your position." She delivered the last 3 words with a particular downward inflection that made them land more like a dismissal than a description. Lucia said nothing. The muscles in her jaw moved once. That was when Derek Holt materialized in the aisle. He had been in the forward galley organizing something, half listening to the exchange the way experienced cabin crew listen to everything that happens in the cabin without appearing to, with their ears rather than their eyes, processing and categorizing. He had categorized this as something that required his intervention, which was correct, and he had categorized the nature of his intervention before he stepped into the aisle, which was where the problem began. "Is there an issue here?" he said, the question directed at Caroline rather than the cabin in general. Thank God Caroline said the switch from aggrieved to relieved, happening so fast it was almost comical. "Yes, Derek." She read his name tag in the same automatic proprietary way she read everything available to her in an environment. "There's been a terrible mix-up. This woman is in my seat. I've been trying to explain it for several minutes now, but I'm not getting anywhere." Derek looked at Diana, then at Caroline, then back at Diana. It took him, by Diana's count, approximately 2 seconds to complete the assessment that Caroline had begun in the aisle. The same calculation arrived at through a slightly different methodology, arriving at the same destination. He did not look at either boarding pass. He did not consult the tablet that crew carried for exactly this kind of seat verification situation. He simply looked at the 2 women, weighed what he saw, and made his decision. "Miss," He said the word landing on Diana with the weight of a choice he had made without examining it. I apologize for the inconvenience. It appears there's been a ticketing issue at the gate. Sometimes the system generates duplicate allocations for high-priority seats. Mrs. Whitmore is one of our most valued platinum members, and company policy does provide for priority seating in these situations. He paused. We have a very comfortable seat available for you in row 12, premium economy. I'll personally see to it that you're given full compensation. A travel voucher. I'm not interested in a voucher, Diana said. Her voice had not changed temperature pitch or speed since she had first spoken. I purchased this seat 6 weeks ago. Full fare. Non-refundable first class. Show me the double booking you're describing. Derek blinked. I'm sorry. Show me the double booking, Diana repeated. You said the system generated a duplicate allocation. Show it to me. Pull up the manifest on your tablet and show me the error. There was a pause, a longer one than Derek had anticipated. The system, he began, is accessible from that tablet right there, Diana said, nodding toward the device clipped to his waistband. Pull it up. Derek's expression shifted through several states in rapid succession. Surprise, irritation, the particular kind of embarrassment that comes from being asked to produce evidence for a claim you fabricated on the spot. He did not pull up the tablet. Ms. Okafor, Lucia began, and then stopped because she had not been told to speak and could feel Derek's attention shift toward her like a spotlight. Ma'am, Derek said, recovering the smooth professional composure he was known for, I understand your frustration. However, I have a responsibility to ensure the comfort of all our passengers, and in situations where there is a dispute over seating company policy does give preference to what Diana said. To louder. To more jewelry. To whom exactly does your policy give preference? The question landed in the cabin like a stone in still water. Caroline made a sound that was not quite a gasp. Raymond Whitmore in Suite 2A looked up from his phone for the first time. Derek's composure held, but only just. Ma'am, I'm going to ask you one more time to gather your belongings and move to the seat we've prepared for you in. And I'm going to tell you one more time, Diana said, that I am not moving. If you believe there is a genuine booking error, show me the documentation. If there is no documentation, then I suggest you return to the galley and allow this boarding process to continue. She picked up her tea and took a sip. Carolyn Whitmore, who had been watching this exchange with the expression of someone watching a tennis match that had unexpectedly gone to a fifth set, made the decision that the situation required escalation. She leaned toward Raymond and said in a voice that was meant to be private but wasn't, Say something, Jay. This is getting ridiculous. Raymond looked up from his phone. He looked at Diana. He looked at Derek. Then he looked back at his wife and said in a tone that had been worn smooth by years of concession, B, it says 2A on your pass. I know what it says, Caroline snapped. That's the mistake. Tell him about the account. Tell him about Halcyon's relationship with the airline. Raymond cleared his throat. He directed the comment toward Derek rather than Diana with the careful social precision of a man navigating a room where he had decided the power was not in the direction he originally thought. My firm manages a substantial portfolio, he said vaguely. We've been loyal customers here for a long time. I'm sure you can appreciate the value of that relationship. Derek did appreciate it. That was visible. He straightened his jacket. I'll have this sorted immediately. Derek told Caroline with a warmth that had been entirely absent from his interactions with Diana. If you'll bear with me one moment. He turned and walked toward the galley. Lucia watched him go. Then she looked at Diana. Diana was looking at her tea. I'm sorry, Lucia said quietly. The words were so low they were barely audible. Don't be sorry, Diana said equally quietly. Just watch. Thomas Brennan in 2K lowered his newspaper 2 inches and looked over the top of it with the focused attention of a man who had just heard testimony he intended to remember. Grace Olivero's pen was moving. Diana was 26 years old, and it was November, and the conference room on the 44th floor of a midtown Manhattan office building smelled like fresh paint and old money, and the coffee that had been brewing since 7 that morning and was now at 11:15 slightly burnt. She had prepared the pitch deck for 11 weeks. 11 weeks of nights after her full-time job weekends in the library every Saturday morning at a desk in her studio apartment with a red pen and a pile of market reports she had bought with money she could not actually spare. The deck was 43 slides. It covered total addressable market competitive landscape 5-year projections under 3 different economic scenarios and a risk analysis that her business professor, the only person she had shown it to, had called more rigorous than most of what I see from students at twice your age. She walked into the conference room in a suit she had bought from a consignment shop in the West Village and altered herself. The alterations were invisible. The suit was good. She sat down at the far end of the table and opened her laptop. There were 4 partners in the room. All of them white. All of them male. All of them in suits that had not come from consignment shops. The senior partner, a man named Clifton, who had the kind of face that suggested he had gone to a very good school and had never once questioned whether he deserved to be there, turned to the partner beside him as Diana was setting up her computer. He didn't lower his voice enough. He didn't try to. "Is she the assistant bringing in the coffee?" Clifton said. Nobody laughed. Nobody corrected him. Diana heard it. She heard every word with the particular clarity that comes from a lifetime of training your ears to catch exactly this kind of thing so it doesn't catch you off guard. She felt the heat of it move up through her chest and into the back of her throat. She clicked to the first slide. "Good morning," she said. "My name is Diana Okafor, and I'm here to talk to you about the most undervalued real estate corridor in the Northeast. You have 47 minutes of my time. Let's not waste them." She pitched for 47 minutes exactly. She did not stumble. She did not rush. She answered every question with the kind of specificity that left no room for follow-up. When the senior partner said with genuine surprise, "You really know your numbers?" she said, "Yes, I do," and moved to the next slide. They rejected the deal. Not because the numbers were wrong. The senior partner in his rejection letter cited strategic misalignment and cultural fit concerns, neither of which referred to anything in the 43 slides. Diana read the letter twice in her car in the parking garage below the building. Then she folded it carefully, put it in the glove compartment, and sat in the dark for 19 minutes. She was not crying. She was thinking. She was thinking about the way the room had felt. The particular texture of being in a space where everyone present had decided before she opened her mouth that she was in the wrong place. She was thinking about how much energy she had would spend just getting into the room at all. Just getting to the part where she could show them what she actually knew. She was thinking, what if I built my own room? 3 years later, Apex Meridian Holdings completed its first acquisition. It was a small building in Newark. Diana signed the papers at a folding table in an attorney's office, and she did not celebrate because she was already thinking about the next one. 7 years after that, Apex Meridian acquired the venture capital firm whose senior partner had asked if she was the assistant bringing in the coffee. Diana did not attend the closing dinner. She sent her COO, Marcus Cole, in her place. Marcus had called her from the restaurant afterward. "You sure you didn't want to be here for this one?" "I was already done with it," Diana told him. "What I want is the one after this." Sitting in Suite 1A, listening to Derek Holt walk back toward the galley without having looked at a single boarding pass, Diana felt the old familiarity of that conference room settle around her like weather. Not surprise, not rage. Something quieter and older. The particular weariness of a person who has been here before and knows exactly how many times here has occurred in the span of a single life. She picked up her phone. She opened her messages to Marcus Cole. She typed, "Begin documentation. Now." She sent it. Then she set the phone back down. In New York, at that moment, Marcus Cole picked up his phone and started a time-stamped log. He had worked with Diana for 9 years. He did not need more than 3 words to understand what was happening and what was expected of him. Have you ever been in a room where someone looked right through you like you weren't there, like you were furniture instead of a person? Tell me in the comments. Because Diana had been in that room more times than she could count. The difference today is that this time she owns the building. And Derek Holt is about to find that out in a way he will spend the rest of his life thinking about. Keep watching. This story has not even started yet. Derek Holt returned from the galley with Scott Navarro walking 1 step behind him. Scott was 35, the first officer on Flight 117, and he moved with the particular authority of someone who had spent his career learning to fill space with his presence. Shoulders back, chin level, the physical language of a man who expected to be listened to and had rarely been disappointed. He was in his Navy uniform with the 4 stripes on his epaulets, and he stopped in the aisle beside Derek in the configuration of someone placed there to make a point through proximity alone. Ms. Okafor, Derek said, having apparently decided that using her name now after having declined to learn or use it in the previous 10 minutes was a diplomatic choice rather than an ironic one. I've spoken with my first officer and we've reviewed the situation. I'm going to need you to move to the premium economy cabin. This isn't a request anymore. The boarding process is being delayed and I have a responsibility to the other passengers. Other passengers who are seated and haven't complained, Thomas Brennan said from 2K without looking up from his newspaper. Derek's eyes moved to him briefly, a flicker, a recalibration, and then returned to Diana. "Ma'am, I need you to stand up." Diana did not stand up. Scott Navarro took 1 step forward. He was close enough now that his presence was a physical fact rather than a social one. A large man in a position of authority occupying the space immediately adjacent to a seated woman in a way that was designed to feel like pressure. He did not touch Diana. He did not need to yet. "You need to come with us," Scott said. Diana looked at him. Her expression did not change. Her hands did not move. Her voice, when it came, had the quality of someone reading aloud from a document they had already read many times. "I am not going anywhere." What happened next occurred in approximately 4 seconds and was witnessed with varying degrees of proximity by every passenger in the first-class cabin. Scott Navarro reached up, without asking, without announcing, without any acknowledgement that what he was about to do required permission, and opened the overhead compartment above Suite 1A. He reached in and took hold of Diana's carry-on roller case. He lifted it out, and he set it down on the floor of the aisle with a deliberate thud, hard enough to be heard, hard enough to communicate intent, hard enough that the sound of it carried to every suite in the forward cabin. The cabin heard it. Thomas Brennan's newspaper went all the way down. Grace Olivero stopped writing. Nora Petit, 29 years old and seated in 2B. She had been doing a very good impression of someone deeply absorbed in a crossword puzzle since the moment Caroline had started talking. Looked up with an expression that was 3 parts alarm and 1 part something she hadn't been prepared to feel shame. Because she had been watching all of this happen and saying nothing, and the sound of that bag hitting the floor had rattled something loose in her. Diana did not look at her bag on the floor. She looked at Scott. "That bag," she said, "belongs to me. You handled my personal property without my consent. You're being removed from—" Scott began. "Lucia." The name was spoken at normal conversational volume, but it cut through the cabin with a precision that the louder voices in the aisle hadn't managed. Lucia Reyes was in the galley entrance holding a water glass she had picked up 2 minutes ago and not yet found occasion to put down. She looked at Diana. Diana didn't gesture, didn't nod, didn't give any particular instruction with her face. She just said the name and looked and waited. Lucia set the water glass down on the nearest surface. She took 3 steps into the aisle. Her heart was doing something unpleasant in her chest. A rapid, irregular knocking that she had learned in 27 years was what happened when you were about to do something that your nervous system wasn't entirely on board with, but your conscience had already decided. "Mr. Navarro," she said. Her voice had a tremor in it that she couldn't entirely suppress, and she was aware of it, and she pushed past it. "That bag belongs to the passenger. You cannot handle a passenger's personal property without consent. That's—" She paused, steadying herself. "That's policy." Scott turned to look at her with the slow, deliberate attention of someone who is trying to communicate without words that the person speaking should reconsider their next action very carefully. "Reyes. Return to the galley." Lucia did not move. There was a long moment, 3 seconds, perhaps 4, in which the cabin was so quiet that the hum of the ground power unit outside was audible through the fuselage. Reyes Derrick said, his voice lower now and harder. "I'm not going to repeat myself." "I know," Lucia said, and then, almost to herself, as if completing a thought she had been having for a long time without quite reaching the end of it. "That's the problem with this cabin. Nothing ever gets repeated. It just keeps happening." She stepped forward. She reached down, picked up Diana's roller case from the floor of the aisle, lifted it to the overhead compartment, and replaced it with the careful, deliberate movements of someone performing an act that was also a statement. She closed the compartment door. She stood back. "Her bag," Lucia said, addressing the space between Derrick and Scott, "is in the overhead where it belongs. Her seat is 1A, where her boarding pass says it is." Caroline Whitmore, who had been watching from Suite 2A with the contained satisfaction of someone who had come to watch a small animal be removed from a space it didn't belong in and was now watching something considerably more complicated unfold, made a sound. "Oh, who does this girl think she is?" Caroline said. The warmth had abandoned her voice entirely now. It was nothing but hard edges. "You are defending her. Look at her." She walked in off the street and sat in a first-class suite she cannot possibly have paid for on her own. She does not belong here, and neither do you if you keep this up. The words "she does not belong here" occupied the cabin the way smoke occupies a room, getting into everything, leaving no corner untouched. Thomas Brennan stood up. He was 60 years old and 6 feet 1 inch tall, and he stood with the kind of unhurried deliberateness that came from 30 years on the federal bench, the posture of a man who understood that the weight of a statement came from its accuracy rather than its volume. "Ma'am," he said, looking at Caroline Whitmore directly. His voice was quiet and completely composed. "I am a retired federal judge from the Second Circuit. I want you to understand that what you just said has been heard by at least 7 witnesses in this cabin, not one of whom will have difficulty recalling it accurately." He let that stand for a moment. "I suggest you consider your next words very carefully." Carolyn's mouth opened, then closed. The color in her face, which had been heading toward crimson for the past several minutes, went through a brief and complicated journey before settling on something that was neither red nor white, but an uncomfortable shade between them. "Raymond Whitmore in Suite 2. A put his phone all the way into his jacket pocket, the specific motion of a man who has recognized that the situation has changed categories entirely, and that whatever was on the screen was no longer relevant to his survival. Grace Olivero's pen was not just moving now. She had filled 2 pages. She flipped to a 3rd. Scott Navarro took a step back from the aisle. Not a retreat. At least not one he would have called a retreat. More of a repositioning, a recalculation. He looked at Derrick, who was looking at the floor of the cabin with an expression that suggested he was arriving slowly and with considerable resistance at a recognition of what he had set in motion. Diana had not moved during any of this. She had not spoken. She had not looked at Lucia when Lucia replaced the bag. She had not looked at Thomas when Thomas spoke. She had sat in 1A with her hands in her lap, and her eyes directed at a middle distance that was neither her tablet nor any particular person in the aisle, and she had let the room do what the room was going to do. Now she picked up her phone. She did not make a call. She opened her messages to Marcus Cole and added one line to the documentation: physical contact with passenger property without consent. First Officer Scott Navarro, witnessed by cabin. She sent it. Then she set the phone down and picked up her tea. Mr. Holt, Diana said, not looking at him, her voice still holding that same impossible levelness. I want you to remember what just happened in this aisle. All of it. Because very soon you're going to be asked to account for it, and I want you to have had time to think. Derek did not respond. But something in his face changed. A small involuntary shift. Not quite fear, not yet, but the first cousin of it. Nora Pettit in 2B looked down at the crossword puzzle in her lap. The grid was still empty. She hadn't filled in a single answer. She closed the magazine. Diana was 33 years old, and it was a Thursday in October, and she was flying first class for the first time in her life. She had bought the ticket herself. Not with miles, not with an upgrade. She had opened the airline's booking portal on a Tuesday night, had looked at the first-class fare, a number that had, for most of her adult life, belonged in the same mental category as yacht ownership and private islands, and she had typed in her card number. Then she had sat at her kitchen table in the apartment she was renting in Lower Manhattan and waited to see if she felt different. She didn't particularly. She still had a full inbox and an early morning call with a potential lender and a leak under the kitchen sink that she'd been meaning to deal with for 3 weeks. The ticket didn't change any of that, but she had looked at the confirmation email for a long time before she closed her laptop. She wore a cream-colored cashmere sweater on the flight. Simple, soft, nothing remarkable. She hadn't yet developed the particular instinct for travel clothes that she would have later, the careful calibration of appearing pulled together without appearing to be trying. She just wore something comfortable and brought a book she never opened because the view out the window over the Atlantic was too interesting to ignore. She was 40 minutes into the flight when the senior flight attendant came to her suite. The woman was pleasant and professional and did not do anything that could be formally objected to. She smiled. She asked if Diana was comfortable. She asked, and this was where it lived in the asking, in the specific phrasing of the question, whether Diana might prefer to move to a section where she might feel more at home. More at home. The phrase was gift-wrapped in genuine-seeming concern. It was delivered with real eye contact and a genuine-seeming smile. It was Diana recognized with the clarity that came from having encountered this pattern many times in many configurations. A request for her to remove herself from a space where her presence made other people uncomfortable, phrased as though the discomfort were hers rather than theirs. Diana said, "I'm very comfortable here, thank you." The attendant said, of course. I just thought." "I'm comfortable here," Diana repeated. The attendant left. Diana turned back to the window. The Atlantic was below them, flat and dark and immense, and she looked at it for a long time and felt something accumulate in her chest that was not quite anger and not quite sadness and not quite anything she had a clean name for. It was just the weight of it. The ongoing cumulative weight of being the person in the room who made rooms uncomfortable without doing anything at all. She opened her notebook. She always traveled with a paper notebook, a habit she'd never broken. And she wrote one sentence. She didn't write it for any audience. She didn't know at 33 that she would one day talk about it. She wrote it because she needed it to exist somewhere outside of her own head. One day I will own the plane. She had not said it to herself as a boast. She had said it the way you say a prayer. Quietly, privately, with the particular combination of doubt and desperate conviction that makes a prayer rather than a statement of fact. 8 years later, she owned the airline. After Scott Navarro stepped back and the bag was returned to the overhead, and Thomas Brennan had said his piece and the cabin had done the thing it needed to do, breathed, recalibrated, remembered that there were other people in it besides the ones making noise, Diana looked at Lucia. Lucia was still standing in the aisle 2 feet from the overhead compartment. Her hands were at her sides. She was doing something specific with her face that Diana recognized, the particular controlled stillness of someone who is holding themselves together from the inside because the outside is being watched. "Thank you," Diana said. The words were quiet enough that only Lucia could hear them clearly. Lucia looked at her. There was something in her eyes that was on the far side of professional, something raw and honest that she was not quite bothering to conceal. "You shouldn't have needed me to do that," she said just as quietly. "No," Diana agreed. "But you did it anyway." "I've worked in this cabin for 3 years," Lucia said. The words came out carefully like she was carrying something fragile. "I've seen this before. Not exactly this, but this shape. And I've stood back every time. I've told myself it wasn't my place." She looked at her own hands briefly, then back up. "I'm tired of it not being my place." Diana looked at her for a moment. "How long have you been with Atlantic Crown?" 3 years. "What did you want to be before you did this?" The question surprised Lucia. It was not the kind of question people asked flight attendants. Or rather, it was not the kind of question anyone had asked her. "I wanted to run a hotel," she said after a beat. "I was in hospitality management. I left because—" She stopped. "Long story. Short version," Diana said. Lucia almost smiled. "The person who was supposed to promote me gave the job to someone who looked more the part is the short version." Diana nodded slowly. The kind of nod that doesn't require a follow-up because everything that needs to be said about it has already been said 1,000 times in 1,000 different rooms, and the only thing left is to make sure it doesn't keep happening. "Go take care of your cabin," Diana said. "We'll talk more later." Lucia nodded. She went back to the galley. Her hands had stopped shaking. Derek Holt had a decision to make, and he made it in the galley in approximately 90 seconds, which was not enough time to make it well. He could de-escalate. He could return to the cabin, verify the boarding passes with appropriate procedural care, confirm that Diana's 1A assignment was accurate and undisputed, apologize to the passenger he had failed to serve, and redirect Mrs. Whitmore to her assigned seat with a complimentary glass of champagne and the kind of professional warmth that turned inconveniences into forgettable anecdotes. He could do all of that. He had the training for it. Somewhere in his 22 years of experience, the correct version of this situation was available to him. He chose differently. He chose differently because Raymond Whitmore had 3 minutes earlier leaned out of Suite 2A and said 6 words into the galley entrance. 6 words that Derek had heard and processed and allowed to change the calculation he was running. The 6 words were halcyon, 400 million, 14 years, said in the flat-clipped shorthand of a man who was accustomed to communicating value in the smallest possible number of words to the largest possible effect. It was not an explicit threat. It was not even technically a statement about the current situation. But Derek had been working transatlantic first class long enough to speak the dialect fluently, and what Raymond Whitmore had said in that dialect was the wrong choice. Here has a cost you haven't fully priced. Derek straightened his tie. He walked back into the cabin. He had Scott Navarro walking behind him, and he had a firmness in his bearing that was the specific kind of firmness that comes not from confidence but from having committed to an action and being unwilling to reverse it, because reversal would require admitting that the action was wrong. "Ms. Okafor," he said. He stopped in the aisle beside Suite 1A. "I've given you every opportunity to resolve this quietly. I'm now telling you, not asking, that you need to gather your belongings and come with me. I've given you every opportunity to look at a boarding pass," Diana said. "You've chosen not to. That choice is yours. "This aircraft doesn't move until you comply," Derek said. "This aircraft doesn't move until the captain authorizes departure," Diana said. "Which means this conversation is going to continue until someone in this process makes a decision based on facts rather than appearances. I'm happy to wait as long as that takes." Caroline from Suite 2A had been building pressure like a sealed container on a stove. She could no longer contain it. She stood up, fully physically stepped into the aisle, and pointed in Diana's direction with the particular energy of someone who has decided that pointing is the correct response to a problem. "Derek, call the captain. Get him out here now. I will not sit behind." She stopped. She looked around the cabin and apparently decided that finishing the sentence was unnecessary. "Get the captain. That's what captains are for." Derek Holt radioed the flight deck. He described the situation in the careful institutional language of someone who knew that what he said on the radio could be reviewed later. Disruptive passenger in first class refusing crew instructions, delaying boarding process. He did not say a black woman won't vacate a seat that may or may not have been legitimately purchased because a wealthy white passenger wants it. He said what he said, and Captain James Ford in the flight deck put down his pre-flight checklist and said, "I'll come out," and came out. Captain Ford was 58 years old and had been flying transatlantic routes for the better part of 3 decades. He had a face that had been weathered by altitude and layovers and the specific stress of being responsible for 300 lives at a time, and it was a face that did not display much. Not surprise, not alarm, not irritation, but processed everything it encountered with the thoroughness of a system that had been running long enough to have seen most things at least once. He stepped into the first-class cabin and scanned it in the automatic, comprehensive way of someone for whom reading a room was a professional requirement. He saw Derek Holt standing with the posture of a man who had already made a decision and needed the captain to ratify it. Scott Navarro standing slightly behind and to the right, performing authority through proximity. Caroline Whitmore in the aisle pointing at a suite. Raymond Whitmore in 2. The careful positioning of a man trying not to be noticed. Thomas Brennan standing in 2K newspaper folded. A journalist with an open notebook. A young woman in 2B who appeared to be trying to disappear through the seat cushion. And in Suite 1A, a woman who was sitting with her hands on her lap, not looking at him, not looking at anyone, apparently occupied with something internal. "What's the situation?" the captain said to Derek. Derek began his version of events. Captain Ford listened with the practiced patience of a man who had learned long ago that the first account of anything is always partial. His eyes moved as Derek spoke across the cabin. They moved to Lucia, who was standing in the galley entrance with the expression of someone watching a building that is on fire and being told by the fire department that there's no smoke. They moved to Thomas Brennan, whose returned gaze was direct and said nothing out loud. And then Captain Ford's eyes moved to Diana Okafor. He looked at her. He looked at her face. He looked at the tablet on the tray table. He looked at the watch on her left wrist. And something in his memory, something that had been sitting dormant since 7 o'clock that morning when he had read a union brief in the pilot's restroom with a coffee in his hand, began to move. Derek was still talking. "Passengers have complained the boarding process is delayed and I'm requesting authorization to have her escorted," Derek, Captain Ford said. Derek stopped. "What did you just say?" Derek's voice held a new note in it. Not quite fear, but the precursor. The recognition that something had changed in the room, and he had not yet identified what. Ford's voice, when it came, was very quiet. It had the quality of a person who is speaking carefully because they are aware that what they say next is going to change a number of things simultaneously, and they want to be sure they say it accurately. "Be quiet," Derek, Captain Ford said. "Step back." Derek stepped back. The authority in those 4 words had moved him before he'd processed that it was happening. And then, from somewhere in the back of the cabin where the silence had been accumulating for the past several minutes, with the patient weight of something that was going to fall eventually. Derek Holt looked at Diana, looked at Captain Ford's expression, and said in a voice that he would spend years trying to take back Captain, "Between you and me, look at her. She doesn't look like she belongs up here. The Whitmores are platinum members. Their account alone is worth more to this airline than 10 rows of economy seats. This isn't a complicated situation." He said it loud enough that Thomas Brennan heard it, that Grace Olivero heard it and wrote it down word for word, that Lucia Reyes in the galley entrance closed her eyes for 1 second because she had known on some level that it was coming, and knowing it didn't make it land any softer. Diana heard it. And for the first time since the boarding process had begun, a very small, very cold smile moved across her face. Not a smile of amusement. Not a smile of victory. The smile of a person who has been waiting for someone to say the quiet part out loud and has just received confirmation that patience is ultimately always rewarded. "Mr. Holt," Diana said, her voice entirely level, "I want you to remember that sentence. Every word. You are going to need to repeat it very soon." Captain Ford was looking at Diana with the expression of a man who has just found the piece of the puzzle that makes the picture make sense, and who is not pleased by what the picture is showing him. Captain James Ford had received the union notification at 7:12 that morning. He had been in the pilot's rest area on the B concourse, sitting in a vinyl chair with a paper coffee cup, and the particular pre-flight restlessness that never fully left him after 30 years, even on routes he had flown 200 times. The notification had come through the union's internal messaging system, an encrypted brief that was sent to senior crew representatives whenever there was a material ownership or management change at the carrier. He was the senior union representative for Atlantic Crown's pilot division, a role he had held for 6 years, and which mostly involved attending quarterly meetings and occasionally forwarding emails. The brief had been 4 paragraphs. He had read it in approximately 90 seconds. The key information was Apex Meridian. Holdings had finalized its acquisition of Atlantic Crown Airlines at 6 o'clock Eastern. The new chief executive was Diana Okafor, founder of Apex Meridian. She was 41 years old. She was known in financial circles for, and the brief had quoted a Bloomberg profile here, an acquisition strategy that moves faster than the target's legal team can respond, and a management philosophy that has no patience for cultures that have calcified around their own comfort. There had been a photograph. The brief had also noted that the new CEO intended to conduct an incognito operational review beginning with transatlantic routes. Crew members were advised to perform their duties as they normally would, as any advance notification would undermine the integrity of the review process. The brief was explicit. Do not alter your behavior because the new owner may be watching. Captain Ford had read this, finished his coffee, thought briefly about what incognito operational review meant in practice, and then gone to the flight deck to begin his pre-flight checklist. He had 47 items on the checklist. The notification had moved to the back of his mind. It did not move back to the front until he was standing in the first-class cabin looking at the woman in Suite 1A, looking at her face, looking at her watch, looking at the quality of stillness with which she occupied a space in which she had been verbally attacked and physically provoked. And something in his brain made the connection that should have been made 40 minutes earlier, when he first boarded. He had seen the photograph at 7:12 that morning. He was looking at the same face now. The blood moved away from James Ford's face with the efficiency of a system that had received a priority alert and was redistributing resources accordingly. He felt cold. He felt the specific total cold of a man who is calculating the distance between where he is standing and the worst professional decision of his career and arriving at an answer of 0. Derek Holt was still talking. The words were reaching Ford's ears, but were being processed at a significant delay. Platinum members. Company policy. The Whitmores. She doesn't look like she belongs, Derek Ford said. Derek stopped. He had never heard the captain use quite that tone before. Not the authority, which was standard, but the particular quietness of it, the controlled tension quality like a cable under enormous load. Captain Ford did not look at Derek. He was looking at Diana. He was looking at the Patek Philippe on her left wrist, a watch he recognized from the photograph in the brief which had included a full-length image as part of the identification profile. He was looking at the matte charcoal roller case in the overhead that Scott Navarro had handled without consent. He was looking at the tablet on the tray table that contained he was suddenly and completely certain operational documents about the airline he was currently standing in. "Be quiet," Ford said. And then when Derek made a sound that suggested he might continue, Derek, "I am asking you to stop talking." Derek stopped. The cabin had been quiet before, but this was a different quality of quiet. The previous quiet had been the quiet of witnesses holding their breath. This was the quiet of witnesses who could feel something about to break open. Captain Ford took 2 steps forward. He stopped at the entrance to Suite 1A. He looked at Diana Okafor directly. She looked back at him with the calm, steady attention of someone who has been expecting this moment and has decided to let it arrive at its own pace. "Ms. Okafor," Captain Ford said. He said it the way you say a name when you know exactly who you're looking at, and the knowing has arrived later than it should have. The cabin heard it. Every person in the first-class section heard the specific 2 words. The Ms., the full name said with that quality, and registered that something fundamental had shifted. Not one of them could have said precisely what they were registering, but they felt it the way you feel a change in altitude through the body before the mind catches up. Carolyn Whitmore turned from her position in the aisle. Her face did something complicated. "What did he just—" Diana looked at Captain Ford. She said, completely calmly, completely without triumph, "Good evening, Captain Ford. Ford said I received the union notification this morning. I should have—" He stopped, restarted. "I should have made the connection immediately. I didn't. That is a failure on my part." He said it simply without drama, in the way of a man who had learned over 30 years that the only productive response to a mistake was to name it clearly and move forward. "I know," Diana said. "You were preoccupied. It happens." "It shouldn't have," Ford said. "Not for this." Derek Holt had been watching this exchange with the expression of a man watching the ground open up beneath his feet, processing slowly, unwillingly, each piece of evidence as it arrived. He looked from Captain Ford to Diana, back to Captain Ford. "What? What is happening right now? Who is she?" "Captain, she's just a—" "Derek." Ford's voice cut across him like a closed door. "Stop. But she—" "Stop talking." This time, the instruction carried the full weight of 30 years of command. Not loud, not angry, but absolute. "Step back." Derek stepped back. His body obeyed before his mind was done arguing. Caroline Whitmore, who had been watching this exchange with an expression cycling rapidly between outrage and confusion, said, "Will someone please tell me what is going on? Because this is absolutely—" Diana stood up. She rose from Suite 1A with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who has been sitting for long enough and has decided it is time to be standing. She was 5 feet 9 inches tall, and she stood with the specific posture of someone who had learned early and thoroughly that the way you occupy a room is a statement that precedes every word you say. She straightened her navy blazer. She looked at the cabin, a single comprehensive sweep that took in Derek Scott, Caroline Raymond Lucia in the galley entrance, Thomas Brennan still standing in 2K, Grace Olivero's open notebook, Nora Pettit's closed crossword puzzle. And then she spoke. Her voice was level and clear and carried to every suite without being raised. "My name is Diana Okafor. I am the founder and CEO of Apex Meridian Holdings. As of 6 o'clock this morning, my company holds a controlling stake in Atlantic Crown Airlines. She paused for precisely one beat. Which means, Mr. Holt, this is not your plane. It is mine. What happened in the next 5 seconds in the first-class cabin of Atlantic Crown Flight 117 was a thing that Grace Olivero would later describe in print as the moment the room reorganized itself around a new center of gravity. Every person in the cabin moved. Not physically, not most of them, but something in each of them shifted in response to those words the way plants shift in response to light, orienting toward what was real. Caroline Whitmore made a sound. It was not a word. It was the sound of a person whose entire operating model for the current situation has just been revealed to be built on a foundation that does not exist. She sat down, fell back into Suite 2A, and the Hermes bag slid from her arm to the floor, and she did not pick it up. Raymond Whitmore put both hands flat on the armrests of his seat and stared at the middle distance. His face had the look of a man performing a rapid and terrible calculation. He was very good at financial mathematics. This calculation was taking longer than he would have liked. Derek Holt looked at Captain Ford with an expression that was somewhere between the hope that the captain would say something that made this untrue and the dawning certainty that he would not. "She's not lying, Derek," Captain Ford said. His voice was entirely flat, the way voices get when a person has used up their available supply of drama. The union brief came through this morning. Ms. Okafor is the new CEO. Derek's mouth opened. No words came out. Scott Navarro behind him took a step backward, then another. He hit the galley curtain and stopped. And Lucia Reyes in the galley entrance exhaled through her nose, a single controlled breath, and felt something in her chest release that she hadn't realized she'd been holding since she first walked into that aisle and told Scott Navarro to put the bag back. Diana did not rush. She never rushed. She had learned years ago that rushing was what people did when they were afraid that if they slowed down the moment would slip away from them. And Diana had never once in her professional life been afraid of a moment slipping away from her because she had always known exactly which moments were hers to keep. She stood at the entrance to Suite 1A and looked at Derek Holt with the same clear, direct attention she had been giving everyone in this cabin since the situation began. Not hostile, not triumphant, just precise. The look of someone who is about to do something that needs to be done and is prepared to do it fully. "Mr. Holt," she said, "let me tell you what you did today. Not what you intended. What you actually did." Derek opened his mouth. Diana raised one hand briefly, a small gesture low unhurried, and his mouth closed. "You did not check my boarding pass. Not when you first approached me, not when I showed you my digital pass, not at any point in the past 30 minutes. She said each sentence with a deliberate pause after it, the way a person reads a list they want to make sure is heard in its entirety. You assumed I was lying about my seat based on the way I look. You made that assumption in less than 3 seconds without reviewing a single piece of documentation." Derek's jaw tightened. "The situation—" "I'm not finished," Diana said with the particular gentleness of someone who is being kind without being soft. "You allowed a passenger in this cabin to state publicly that women like me don't sit in row 1. You heard those words. You were in the aisle when they were said. You did not correct her. You did not defend the person those words were directed at. Instead, you used her complaint as justification for your own actions." Diana's voice did not rise. It did not need to. "You had your first officer remove my bag from the overhead bin without my consent, without asking, without acknowledging that the bag was mine and that what he was doing required my permission." Scott Navarro against the galley curtain studied the floor of the cabin with the focused attention of someone who has decided that not moving is the least bad available option. And then Diana continued, You stood in front of your captain and said, "I want you to hear this repeated back to you precisely, that I don't look like I belong in first class, that the Whitmore account is worth more to this airline than 10 rows of economy." You said those words out loud in this cabin in front of 7 witnesses. She held his eyes. Those were your words, Mr. Holt. Not an interpretation of them, not a paraphrase. Exactly what you said. Derek's face moved through something that was not quite an emotion, but resembled the country right next to one. Ms. Okafor, I've been with this airline for 22 years. I have a family. I have a pension. I was operating under what I believed were the best interests of the company. The platinum member policy is illegitimate. No, Diana said quietly. You were not operating under company policy. Company policy says verify the boarding pass before any reseating action. You did not do that. You skipped that step because the step would have given you information that contradicted what you had already decided. She let that settle for a moment. A policy you invoke only when it supports a decision you've already made is not a policy. It is a tool for justifying a choice that was made for other reasons. Derek's mouth opened again, closed again. The particular frustration of a man who has run out of arguments, but has not yet run out of the feeling that he should have one. I've reviewed your personnel file, Diana said. Not recently. I reviewed it 2 weeks ago as part of the operational audit I conducted before the acquisition finalized. You have 11 formal passenger complaints in 22 years. 7 of those complaints were filed by passengers who identified themselves as Black or Hispanic. 2 were filed by junior crew members. All 11 were closed. She paused. Every single one was closed without independent review. Most of them were signed off by you. The cabin absorbed this in silence. Thomas Brennan, who was still standing, did not move. Grace Olivero had stopped writing because she was looking directly at Diana, and she had the expression of someone who is watching something happen that they have been trying to document for years and have never seen as clearly as this. That is not a series of isolated incidents, Mr. Holt, Diana said. That is a pattern that was allowed to continue because no one in this airline's leadership wanted to look at it directly. I am looking at it directly. As of today, that pattern ends. She reached into the pocket of her blazer and took out her phone. She opened her messages. Marcus, she said into the phone rather than typing. She had called her COO at some point in the past 2 minutes without anyone in the cabin noticing her do it, which was characteristic. Add to the documentation, Derek Holt, Chief Purser, Flight 117 terminated for cause effective immediately. Grounds failure to follow passenger verification protocols, conduct unbecoming a senior crew member, and a documented record of complaint suppression. Pension forfeiture to be reviewed by HR under the cause termination clause. Marcus Cole's voice came through the phone. Calm professional recording, everything, confirmed Diana. I have it. Derek made a sound. It was not a full sentence. It was the sound of 22 years landing on a person all at once. You can't do this. Not here. Not like this. There are procedures. There are, Diana agreed. Priya Santos. Our European HR director is meeting this flight at Heathrow. She has your paperwork. The formal process will be completed upon landing. She put the phone back in her pocket. What I can do here right now is relieve you of your duties for the remainder of this flight. You will go to the aft jump seat. You will not interact with passengers. You will surrender your company ID to Captain Ford before you take a step in that direction. Derek looked at Captain Ford with the last reserves of the hope that someone would save him from this. Ford looked back at him with the expression of a man who has run out of lifelines to offer and knows it. Derek Ford said, "Give me the ID." It took 11 seconds. 11 seconds of Derek Holt standing in the aisle of a first-class cabin with his hand near his breast pocket, calculating whether there was anything left to calculate. Then his hand moved, He unpinned the company ID from his lapel. He held it out. Ford took it without comment. Derek Holt walked toward the rear of the aircraft without looking at anyone. Nobody watched him go. Or rather, everyone watched him go, but nobody made it visible. Some things are witnessed better in peripheral vision. Diana turned to Scott Navarro. Scott had been extraordinarily still since Diana had stood up. The specific stillness of a man who has understood with some clarity that stillness is currently the best available strategy. Mr. Navarro, Diana said. You took hold of a passenger's personal property without consent. You used your physical presence to apply pressure to a seated passenger. And when a junior crew member, Ms. Reyes, attempted to correct a clear procedural error, you ordered her to stand down. She paused. You are suspended from active duty, effective immediately pending a full conduct review. Whether you return to flight operations after that review will depend on that review's findings, not on anything else. Scott said nothing. He nodded once. The minimal, careful nod of a man who has done the math and understood that the available options have reduced to one. He moved to the side of the galley and stayed there. Diana turned to Carolyn Whitmore. The cabin, which had been holding itself very carefully for the past several minutes, seemed to hold itself a fraction more carefully still. Caroline was in Suite 2A. She had not moved since she sat down after Diana stood up. The Hermes bag was still on the floor where it had slid. She was looking at Diana with an expression that had moved past defiance and through shock, and arrived somewhere that was difficult to name, something small and unprotected that Caroline Whitmore had probably not shown to very many people and was not showing intentionally now. Mrs. Whitmore, Diana said. Her voice shifted. Not softer exactly, but different in quality. Not the voice of a CEO executing decisions. Something more direct than that. You told me that women like me don't sit in row 1. You said that out loud. In public, without hesitation, as though it were a fact rather than a choice. Caroline opened her mouth. Nothing emerged. You are a paying passenger on this aircraft, and I will not remove you from it, Diana continued. But I want you to understand something clearly so that there is no room for misinterpretation. She held Caroline's gaze with the same steady directness she had given everyone else in this cabin. Your platinum membership with Atlantic Crown is revoked effective today. You and your husband are permanently banned from flying on any aircraft operating under the Atlantic Crown name or its partner carriers. Caroline's voice when it arrived was smaller than any voice she had used since boarding. We spend tens of thousands of dollars. I know, Diana said. That number has no relevance to this decision. None. Raymond Whitmore, in his seat, said nothing. He was doing the calculation Diana had seen beginning on his face 11 minutes ago, and by his expression he had reached the answer, and the answer was not good. Diana turned last to Lucia Reyes. The shift in her manner was visible to everyone in the cabin. Not a dramatic shift. Diana did not do dramatic, but visible the way a change in light is visible a degree of warmth entering the air. Miss Reyes, Diana said, you made a choice in this cabin today that cost you something. You didn't know what it would cost you when you made it. You made it because it was right. Lucia was standing very still. Her hands were at her sides. She was doing something carefully controlled with her face. You put my bag back in the overhead when it had been removed without cause. You told a first officer, your senior, that he was wrong in front of passengers at professional risk to yourself. You did that before you had any reason to think it would be recognized. Diana paused. I want to recognize it. Ms. Reyes, you are formally commended. I am personally recommending you for the lead attendant training program when enrollment opens next quarter. You will be supported through that program by my office. And I want you to come speak with me during the flight. Not about this. Not about any of this. About what you told me in this suite before all of this happened. About what you wanted to do before you got here. About what comes next. Lucia's composure, which had held through everything, came very close to its edge. She steadied it. She nodded. It was a small nod, and it contained a great deal. One more thing Diana said, addressing the cabin as a whole, not performing it, just speaking to the room. This conversation, all of it, has been documented from the moment it began. Marcus Cole, my COO in New York, has been maintaining a time-stamped record. If anyone in this cabin witnessed what occurred today and would like to provide a formal account, you will have the opportunity to do so. She looked briefly at Thomas Brennan, who gave a single nod, at Grace Olivero, who held up her notebook. Captain Ford, you may return to the flight deck. We are already delayed. Ford nodded. He turned toward the cockpit without another word. Diana sat down in Suite 1A. She picked up her tea. It had gone cold. She drank it anyway. The first-class cabin of Atlantic Crown Flight 117 did something in the minutes after Diana sat back down that cabins very rarely do. It was quiet in a way that felt deliberate rather than habitual. Not the polite, uncomfortable quiet of people pretending not to have witnessed something awkward. The considered, weighted quiet of people sitting with something they had seen and were still processing. Thomas Brennan moved first. He was a man who had learned in 4 decades of legal work that the moments immediately following a significant event were often more revealing than the event itself. That what people did in the wake of things told you as much about them as what they did during. He stepped into the aisle and walked forward 2 rows to Suite 1A. Ms. Okafor, he said. Diana looked up from her tablet. I'm Thomas Brennan, retired Second Circuit. He said it without ceremony. I want you to know that I was present for this entire situation. I have a clear and detailed memory of what occurred, including the specific language used by both the chief purser and Mrs. Whitmore. I'm happy to provide a written account if that would be useful for your documentation. I appreciate that, Diana said. Mr. Cole has my contact information if you're willing to reach out. Brennan nodded. Then he said in the same practical, unembellished register, You handled that with a precision I have not seen often. In any context. He paused. For what it's worth. It's worth something, Diana said. He returned to his seat. He picked up the Wall Street Journal. He did not read it. He held it open in front of him and thought the way a man who has spent his life listening to other people's stories does when he has witnessed something that will stay with him. Grace Olivero came forward next, but she stopped at the edge of Suite 1A rather than entering it, and she held up her notebook rather than her press credentials. I'm Grace Olivero. I write about travel, luxury travel passenger experience. I've been taking notes since we boarded. She said it plainly without apology, but also without presumption. I know I didn't say anything during... You documented it, Diana said. That's different from doing nothing. I want to write about this, Grace said. Not sensationally, accurately. Diana was quiet for a moment. Write what you saw, that's all anyone can ask. A beat. Come find me at Heathrow if you need a comment on the record. Grace nodded and returned to 3A. She opened her notebook to a clean page and started writing from the beginning. Not the notes she had taken in the moment, which were impressionistic and rapid, but the version she would turn into something real. She wrote for the rest of the boarding process without stopping. Nora Pettit did not speak to Diana. She was 29 years old and had sat in Suite 2B through the entirety of what had unfolded in the cabin, and she had not said a word, and she was aware of this in a way that had moved from uncomfortable to actively painful over the course of the past 20 minutes. She picked up her crossword puzzle magazine and then put it back down. She looked at the window. She looked at the floor. She looked at the closed shell door of Suite 1A, behind which Diana Okafor was presumably reading documents or reviewing notes or doing something that a person who owned an airline did on a flight. Nora was getting an MBA from Wharton. She had spent 3 semesters studying leadership, reading case studies, writing papers, sitting in seminars where professors talked about moral courage and decisive action and the importance of speaking up when something wrong was happening in front of you. She had thought she understood those concepts. She had thought she was the kind of person who would act on them when the situation called for it. She had sat in suite 2B and said nothing. She opened the tray table and took out a notepad. She always traveled with one, an old habit from her undergraduate years, and she wrote something on it. Not for anyone else. Just for herself. What would it have cost you to say one thing? Find out before the next time. She folded the notepad and put it in her jacket pocket. She would keep it there for months. She would look at it sometimes when she needed to. In the aft galley, separated from the first-class cabin by 2 metal carts and a thick curtain, Derek Holt sat on the jump seat with his company ID gone from his lapel and his silver purser's tie, feeling for the first time like a costume rather than a rank insignia. 22 years. He had built a life around those 22 years. The seniority, the pension, the specific pride of managing a first-class cabin on transatlantic routes. The feeling of being someone who mattered in a defined, recognized way. He sat on the jump seat and thought about 11 complaints. He had always told himself that those complaints were minor, that he had handled them correctly, that the passengers who filed them had been looking for trouble or were misinterpreting standard procedure or simply hadn't understood the complexity of his job. He sat in the jump seat alone in the galley with the sound of the engines coming up beneath him, and he knew, with the specific, unwelcome clarity of someone whose usual defenses have been removed, that he had never believed those things. He had just needed to believe them, and he had never been required to stop. Lucia Reyes moved through the first-class cabin alone, preparing it for departure with the careful, efficient movements of someone who has been given a task and intends to do it completely. She checked seatbelts, confirmed overhead compartments, confirmed that every passenger had what they needed. When she reached Suite 1A, she paused. Diana was reading something on her tablet. The tea was empty. Lucia took the cup without being asked and replaced it with a fresh one, jasmine, no sugar, brewed at the correct temperature, and set it quietly on the tray table. Diana looked up. Lucia gave a small professional nod. Not servile, not performative, just the acknowledgement of one person who has done something for another. Diana nodded back. The same quality. 2 people who understood each other without needing to say so. Lucia moved on. She finished the cabin checks. She took her position for departure. Outside the windows, the JFK tarmac was doing its usual thing. Trams and luggage vehicles and the coordinated, purposeful movement of an airport that never stops. And the cabin sealed itself around its passengers, and Flight 117 began to move. At 35,000 feet, the Atlantic was a flat, infinite darkness beneath them, lit only by the occasional light of a cargo ship tracking its slow path below the cloud layer. The cabin had dimmed to its sleep setting, the soft ambient purple that the automatic system defaulted to an hour into the overnight portion of transatlantic routes. Most passengers had reclined. Some were asleep. Diana Okafor was not asleep. She had been awake for 21 hours at a slightly elevated level of alertness that she recognized as the particular wakefulness of a day when something significant has happened and the mind refuses to let go of it. Not because the mind is distressed, but because the mind is still working, still turning it over, earning, still finding new edges. She was reviewing documents on her tablet. The documents were the operational overview she had been reading before boarding, the performance metrics, the complaint logs, the HR summaries that had formed the backbone of Apex Meridian's due diligence before the acquisition finalized. She was reading them differently now, with more specificity. The message from Marcus Cole arrived at 1:47 in the morning New York time. It appeared in her encrypted messages portal with the subject line Holt. Full background complete. Diana opened it. Marcus had been thorough. He always was. The document attached was 14 pages, and Diana read all of it slowly, with the light from her tablet the only illumination in the darkened suite around her. The summary, which Marcus had placed at the front rather than the back because he knew how Diana read things, said the following. In 22 years at Atlantic Crown, Derek Holt had received 11 formal passenger complaints. This she already knew. What the deeper audit had surfaced was the following: of those 11 complaints, 9 had been received, initially logged, and then recategorized within the system within 48 hours of receipt. Recategorized from active complaint, pending review, to resolved, crew discretion. The recategorization in each case had been performed by Derek Holt himself using his chief purser access credentials. The 9 recategorized complaints had never been reviewed by Atlantic Crown's HR department. They had never been seen by the Passenger Advocacy Office. They had never been escalated to any level of management above Holt's direct supervisor, a man named Gerald Marsh, who had retired 11 months ago with a full pension and a send-off party in the Heathrow crew room. 3 of those 9 complaints had included requests from the filing passengers for formal follow-up. They had received in each case a form letter from Atlantic Crown's Customer Relations Department thanking them for their feedback and informing them that the matter had been reviewed and addressed appropriately. The matter had not been reviewed. The matter had been made to disappear. Marcus had added a note at the bottom of the summary, in his direct, unembellished way. This wasn't one bad employee making individual bad decisions, Diana. This was someone who understood exactly how the reporting system worked and used that knowledge to protect himself. And Marsh knew. His sign-off is on the recategorizations from 2019 and 2021. He retired before anyone looked closely. Holt would have done the same. Diana set the tablet down on her lap. She looked at the darkness outside the window for a long time. She had known before today that Atlantic Crown had a culture problem. She had seen it in the aggregate data, the complaint volumes, the retention rates, the passenger satisfaction scores that had been declining for 4 years while the airline's senior management had been attributing the decline to fuel costs and route competition and every external factor available. She had known it was an internal problem. She had come to see exactly how internal. She had not anticipated this level of specificity, this level of deliberateness. It wasn't just carelessness. It was maintenance. Someone had been tending to the rot, keeping it contained and invisible for years, and the people who should have caught it had either not been looking or had decided that looking wasn't worth the disruption. She opened a reply to Marcus. She typed for 3 minutes. The message when she sent it was 9 bullet points. A complete set of instructions for the audit she now wanted conducted not just on Derek Holt's complaint history, but on every complaint submitted to Atlantic Crown in the past 5 years. Every recategorization, every sign-off, every instance where a passenger had filed a concern and received a form letter rather than an actual response. "If it's buried, we find it," she wrote at the end. "And if we find it, we respond to it. Everyone who was told their complaint had been addressed when it hadn't. They hear from us directly, personally, not from a form letter, from someone with a name and a title who can actually do something." Marcus replied within 4 minutes. She had no idea if he was sleeping, and she did not ask, understood. "Team is assembled. We start in the morning." Diana closed the tablet. She looked at the window for another long moment. Then she did something she rarely did in flight. She closed her eyes. Not to sleep. She didn't sleep on planes, never had. But to sit with what she knew and what it meant and what she intended to do about it. The engines held their steady note around her. The Atlantic continued its dark passage below. She had come on this flight to see the truth. She had seen considerably more of it than she had expected. That was not a complaint. That was a beginning. The Whitmore suite at Claridge's was on the 4th floor and had a view of Brook Street that cost per night approximately what a junior Atlantic Crown flight attendant earned in 2 weeks. It had heavy drapes and a writing desk with actual stationery and a bathroom with heated floors. Caroline Whitmore had stayed in it 6 times. She knew the room number by heart. She did not notice any of those things when she arrived. She put her Hermes bag, the one that had slid to the floor and stayed there for 20 minutes while Diana spoke to the cabin, the one she had retrieved from the floor of Suite 2A, without quite being able to look at anyone while she did so, on the luggage rack, and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall. Raymond closed the suite door behind them. He did not say anything immediately. He moved to the minibar, opened it, looked at the options, and poured 2 fingers of something into a glass and drank half of it before he turned around. "Don't," Caroline said. "I haven't said anything. You're about to." Raymond set the glass down. "B, you need to understand what I'm telling you. About Halcyon. About the Vanguard. I know about Vanguard." "Holdings," Caroline said with the specific irritability of someone who does not know about Vanguard Holdings but cannot bear to admit it. "I know who she is." "You didn't know who she was this morning." "I didn't know she owned the airline this morning." "You told her she didn't belong in first class," Raymond said. His voice was very quiet. "You said that. Out loud." "I said—" Caroline stopped. The hotel room was very still around her. "People say things in the moment. Nobody takes those things." "She does," Raymond said. "And so does her documentation team. And so does the journalist who was sitting in 3A. He sat down in the chair across from the bed. The glass was still in his hand. He put it on the coffee table. "I need to tell you something. About the Apex Meridian account." Caroline's head turned slowly toward him. Raymond explained it. He explained it precisely and in the correct order because he was a man who had made his career communicating complex financial information. And even now, even in this context, the professional habit held. Halcyon Wealth Partners was in the final round of a competitive pitch for the management of a $3 billion pension fund. The fund was held by Apex Meridian Holdings. The decision was scheduled for Friday. Caroline listened. Her face did not change expression during the explanation, but the quality of her stillness changed, from the stillness of a person who is thinking to the stillness of a person who has stopped thinking because the thing they have just been told is too large to think around immediately. $3 billion, she said. "Approximately, yes. And her company holds the fund." Raymond picked up his phone. He had received 3 messages in the past hour that he had not opened, and he opened them now. 2 were from colleagues at the firm. 1 was from James Holbrook Halcyon's CEO, sent at 7:42 London time. Raymond read it. He read it twice. He put the phone face down on the table. "James is calling me in," Raymond said. "Tonight. He wants me in his office before the markets open." Caroline was very still. "What does it say?" "It says I need to come in." He stopped. He looked at the phone face down on the table and then at his wife and then at a point somewhere between them. "B, the post. The Instagram post. You need to take it down. I'm not taking it down. It's already been seen by—" "Take it down," Raymond said with a sharpness that surprised them both. He had not spoken to Caroline in that tone in years, maybe ever. "You need to understand what you've done. Not to me, though you've done something to me and we're going to need to talk about that eventually, but what you've done to yourself. You've tagged Bloomberg and the Financial Times on a post calling the owner of a major airline aggressive and implying her seat was fraudulent. You did that with your real name, on your real account." Caroline took her phone from the bedside table. She opened the social media app. The post had 4,000 comments. She had last looked at it on the taxi from Heathrow when the comments had been largely supportive, people in her social circle, people who traveled the same routes and stayed at the same hotels and had their own stories about the indignities of modern air travel being weaponized against the people who truly deserved to enjoy it. The comments were no longer largely supportive. Someone had found the press conference. The live feed from Diana's announcement at Apex Meridian's London headquarters had clipped into a 30-second video that had been posted by 4 major news accounts in the past 2 hours. The clip showed Diana at the podium in the same navy blazer saying, "I was the passenger Mrs. Whitmore is referring to." And then she looked at me, made a judgment based on her own deep-seated bias, and decided I did not look like I belonged in her presence. The comments on Caroline's post had turned, not gradually. All at once, the way these things turned the moment critical mass was reached. 4,000 comments, and the new ones were coming in faster than the older ones could be scrolled past, and almost none of them were what Caroline had been reading on the taxi from the airport. Her hands were cold. She didn't notice until she tried to type, and her fingers weren't working correctly. Raymond's phone rang. He looked at the screen. James Holbrook, Halcyon, CEO. Direct line. Raymond answered. He listened for 1 minute and 40 seconds. Caroline watched his face, which was doing something she had very rarely seen it do in 23 years of marriage. It was losing its composure in real time, not dramatically, but steadily, the way a structure loses integrity under load, incrementally, and then all at once. He said, "I understand." He said, "I'll be there." He ended the call. He set the phone very carefully on the table. Raymond. Caroline said, "I've been let go," Raymond said. The sentence had the quality of something he was testing, saying the words aloud to see if they would become more or less real in the air. "The Apex Meridian account is gone. Pulled this afternoon with a formal communication citing conduct concerns connected to the Flight 117 incident." He paused. "James is citing the morality clause in my contract." The room was very quiet. She knew about Halcyon, Caroline said. She knew everything. She owns an investment conglomerate. Of course she knew. Raymond's voice had moved past anger into something flatter and more permanent. "She didn't take the account because of us, B. She pulled the account because of you, because you posted a photo of her and called her aggressive." He looked at his wife with the careful, exhausted look of a man who has run the calculation and arrived at a result he cannot dispute. "She didn't come after us. We built this ourselves." Caroline looked at the phone in her hand. The comments continued to arrive. The notifications were a continuous stream. Her phone, which she had always experienced as something that confirmed and amplified her sense of herself, was showing her something entirely different now. A version of the morning's events that bore no resemblance to the version she had been telling herself since she walked off the plane. She put the phone face down on the bed. It vibrated once, twice, kept going. "I need to call someone," she said. It wasn't clear who she meant. It wasn't clear there was someone to call. Raymond stood up. He picked up his jacket. He looked at it for a moment and then set it back down without putting it on. "I'm going to go deal with James," he said. "I'll be back later." He moved toward the door. He stopped with his hand on the handle. He said without turning around, "For what it's worth, B, when she stood up in that cabin, she didn't even look at you." He opened the door. "That's not what winning looks like when someone's angry. That's what it looks like when someone just doesn't need to." He left. The door closed behind him. In the suite, Caroline Whitmore sat alone with her notifications and the heated bathroom floors and the stationery on the writing desk and the Hermes bag on the luggage rack and the knowledge that she had said something true on that plane. She had said exactly what she thought without filter, without hesitation, loudly enough for the whole cabin to hear. And it had cost her everything that had mattered to her husband, and more that would cost her in the coming weeks. And it had changed nothing about who Diana Okafor was or what she owned. The press conference was held at 11 o'clock London time in the main briefing room of Apex Meridian's European headquarters on St. James's Square, and it was attended by approximately 90 journalists representing 22 media outlets across print broadcast and digital. It had been called officially to announce the completion of the Atlantic Crown acquisition, and that was what it was, until the question period began. Diana stood at the podium in the same navy blazer she had worn on the flight. She had not changed it. She had considered the possibility that changing it would seem more polished, more prepared, more CEO-like in the way that press conferences sometimes demanded. And she had decided that wearing the same thing she had worn when she was told she didn't belong in first class was more truthful than anything she could put on instead. Truth in Diana's experience was almost always more interesting than polish. She walked through the acquisition details with the efficiency of someone who knew the material completely and was not performing knowledge but simply conveying it. The structure of the deal, Apex Meridian's strategic intentions for the Atlantic Crown brand, the projected timeline for operational reforms. She answered 3 questions about fleet modernization and 2 about the competitive landscape in transatlantic routes. She was precise and direct, and by the 12th minute had given the assembled press corps everything they had come for in terms of business news. And then a correspondent from Reuters, a woman named Sarah Nakamura, who had been covering corporate acquisitions for 15 years and had the particular stillness of someone who asks questions for a living, raised her hand. Ms. Okafor. There's been a story developing since early this morning. A social media post now viral from a passenger on your inaugural flight as Atlantic Crown's owner. The post alleges aggressive behavior by a passenger and claims the flight crew was unfairly disciplined. Given your presence on that flight, can you respond? Diana looked at the primary camera. She held the room the way she held every room, not by filling it, but by making her stillness impossible to look away from. I can, she said. I was the passenger being described. The room responded the way press rooms respond to genuine news. A wave of movement, rapid typing the muted sound of 60 journalists simultaneously adjusting their priorities for the next 20 minutes. Diana continued speaking steadily over the movement. This morning, I boarded Atlantic Crown Flight 117 from New York to London. I was in my assigned seat. A fellow passenger decided without evidence and without consulting the crew that I was in the wrong place. A senior crew member chose to support that assessment without verifying a single piece of documentation. What followed was 30 minutes of escalating conduct that included the removal of my personal property from the overhead compartment without consent and a public statement made by the chief purser that I do not look like I belong in first class. The room was completely silent now. The typing had stopped. Everyone was listening. I want to be clear about the outcome. Diana's voice did not change speed or temperature. The chief purser, Derek Holt, was relieved of his duties and has been formally terminated with cause. The first officer involved has been suspended pending review. The passenger who initiated the situation has been permanently banned from Atlantic Crown and its partner carriers. She paused for 3 seconds, not for effect, but because she was choosing her next words. I also want to say this. What happened today was not an accident. It was not a one-time failure. It was the visible surface of a culture that has been developing in this airline's management for years. A way of doing things that decided without ever putting it in writing that some passengers were worth more protection than others, that some complaints could be buried, that some behaviors in the cabin could be maintained indefinitely as long as no one senior enough was watching. She looked at the camera. I was watching. I intend to keep watching. The questions that followed were numerous, and she answered them all briefly without elaboration where elaboration wasn't needed. Yes, there would be a full audit of passenger complaints over the past 5 years. Yes, all affected passengers would be contacted individually. Yes, the crew training program would be overhauled before the end of the financial year. At the end of the question period, a journalist from a travel industry publication asked Ms. Okafor, "What would you say to the passengers in that cabin who witnessed what happened and said nothing?" Diana thought for a moment. I would say that silence in those moments is a choice, and choices have costs. But I would also say that I understand it. The cost of speaking up when you don't know who is watching or what will follow. I don't need everyone to be brave. She paused. I need institutions that make bravery less necessary. That's what we're building. She stepped back from the podium. The briefing room remained noisy for a long time after she left it. The consequences organized themselves over the following 48 hours with the quiet, irresistible efficiency of things that have been set in motion by people who know what they're doing. Derek Holt's termination was finalized by Priya Santos at Heathrow Terminal 3 in a meeting that lasted 22 minutes and which Derek attended with a union representative who reviewed the documentation, confirmed its accuracy, and advised his client to sign the paperwork. Derek signed. He walked out of the airport with his personal belongings in a box and the knowledge that in 22 years he had made himself entirely unrehirable in the sector that had defined him. Scott Navarro's suspension was logged with the union and the regulatory authority. The review was assigned to a 3-person panel. At the end of it, he would be cleared to return to flight operations, on a different route under a different crew structure following completion of a mandatory conduct retraining program that he would describe to colleagues afterward as the most uncomfortable professional experience of his life. The Apex Meridian account at Halcyon Wealth Partners had been formally withdrawn before Raymond Whitmore's meeting with James Holbrook concluded. The morality clause in Raymond's contract was reviewed by Halcyon's legal team and upheld. By Thursday evening, Raymond Whitmore's office was being emptied into boxes. Caroline Whitmore's social media post, which she had taken down at 11:45 London time, approximately 90 minutes after Diana's press conference, had by then been screenshot and reposted by 3,000 accounts. The deletion made no practical difference. It would make no practical difference for a long time. Grace Olivero's piece, published 10 days after the flight in her magazine's digital edition, ran to 4,200 words under the headline, "The Seat She Owned." It received more reader responses than anything the publication had run in 7 years. 6 months after Flight 117, Lucia Reyes began the first day of the lead attendant training program at Atlantic Crown's refurbished training facility in the Heathrow campus, a building that had been renovated over the summer as part of the operational overhaul Diana had initiated with better lighting and actual comfortable chairs and a curriculum that had been written entirely from scratch by people who had been in the cabin rather than people who had only managed it from a distance. On the first day, the program director asked the 12 trainees to introduce themselves and say one thing they had learned since joining the airline. When it was Lucia's turn, she said, "I learned that there is a difference between doing your job and doing what's right inside your job, and that the second one is always available to you even when it's scary, especially when it's scary." Nobody in the room knew what she was referencing. That was fine. She wasn't saying it for them. 8 months after the flight, Diana boarded Atlantic Crown Flight 117 again. Same route, same departure time, different crew. She sat in Suite 1A. The jasmine tea appeared before she asked for it. The lead attendant on duty had pulled her preference from the passenger profile system, which had been updated and made functional as part of the same operational overhaul. The cabin was properly lit. The fragrance diffuser had been replaced with something that smelled like nothing in particular, which was the right choice. When she settled in and opened her tablet, nobody asked her to move. Nobody looked at her twice. Nobody performed comfort or exaggerated welcome. They simply did their jobs well with the natural ease of people who had been trained to see the person in the seat rather than the assumptions they arrived with. Diana opened her tablet and made a single note at the top of the document she was working on. One word, progress. She underlined it once. Then she went back to work. Diana never told the story publicly herself. Not the version of it that was personal, not the version that lived in her chest. She let Grace's article and the press conference record stand as the account available to people who needed one. What she kept was simpler and more private. The knowledge that she had sat in her seat when someone told her to leave it, and that she had been right to stay, and that nothing about being right had required her to shout or threaten or perform anger for anyone's benefit. She had just sat there and waited for the truth to do its work the way she had been waiting her entire life in room after room for exactly that. The truth had always come eventually. Today it had come in 40 minutes on a plane she happened to own. Tomorrow it would come somewhere else for someone else, maybe slower, maybe at greater cost. And that person might not own the plane, and the weight they would have to carry through the waiting would be heavier than anything Diana had ever been asked to carry. She knew that. She held that. And she kept working because the only answer she had ever found to any of it was to keep building. Keep building something real. Something that couldn't be argued with, something that made the rooms she walked into a little more honest than they had been before she arrived. She owed that to the version of herself who had sat in a parking garage in Atlanta at 26 years old and decided to try again. She owed it to Lucia and to Nora Pettit with her empty crossword puzzle, and to every person who had ever been told the seat wasn't theirs. It was always theirs. It had always been theirs. You just had to be willing to sit down and stay. If this story reached something in you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you believe that dignity should never have to prove itself, hit the like button and subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story like this one. Leave a comment below and tell us. Have you ever sat in a room where someone decided you didn't belong? We read every single one. Come back for the next story. It might be about someone who looks exactly like you.